The Magnificent Moreci by M.A. Turner. Narrated by M.A. Turner. I dedicate this to my mother, who I love more than the world itself. Gatsby must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Forward. You know, I always had reservations about this book going anywhere. I believe that The Great Gatsby could be improved if it were brought into a modern setting. Perhaps the olden feeling was what made it so magical. Regardless, I saw a raw and ambiguous tale come to life in my mind. For that, there were so many ideas waiting. I knew that this could go somewhere. I just didn't know where. I hope you take something away from this story. I poured my heart into it. I've often wondered what it would feel like to have written a novel. A lot of preparation and willpower went into making it. It wasn't a throwaway project or simple procedure. 49,000 words is not an easy task. It's monumental in every regard. But as time goes along, I felt compelled to continue the story. This leads me to reveal that before the fall of 2023, I will have finished the sequel to the book, titled The Ghosts That Bear. I speak more about it in the upcoming novel, Falling Daemons. This leads me to speak on how I went about writing this. Even though it only took 18 days to write, the novel had much more put into it than that. It takes snacks, coffee, and a lot of minutes to write 49,000 words, and even more time to edit for structure, grammar, and spelling. Revising it to a second and third draft takes another few days. It's a monumental feat that wouldn't have been possible without the help of Sandra Sampson, Dr. Jonathan Doyle, my mother, and Cynthia Mitchell, who named this book and was along for the ride the entire way. My next note is that, reading The Great Gatsby about 5 times, I felt a strange bond with the character of Gatsby. It's almost as if I feel the things he felt. Once you connect with a character, it takes you on the same trip they go on. In a way, I've experienced the same heartbreak and betrayal, and it's helped me to pen such a momentous work. It wouldn't have been possible without the people mentioned, and I'd love to thank them again for listening, advising, supporting me, and teaching me the ways of being a good storyteller. I owe them the world and more. I hope you enjoy reading this book, and all the books to follow. Live big. Acknowledgement. I credit my mother for loving me as much as she does. I give Miss Lacey Thompson the credit for showing me just how special The Great Gatsby really is. Finally, and most importantly, I acknowledge Sandra for keeping me alive. It would have been gone so long ago if it wasn't for Dr. Doyle and her. These two have been instrumental in keeping me alive. I'm blessed to know them. Prologue. Ever since I was a child, my father had been instilling a passion of sense into me. Me and him never shared the same sentiments. I lived for the single purpose of living. Even that was far more than one reason in itself. I went through 18 years before ever stopping to think things were changing. Things were more than they used to be. In the tender wealth of youth, one's vitality need not be bothered by the vivacious world around them. Youth is but a veil itself, covering the merciless truth. I found this brutal fact rightly named, titled well for how cruel it really was. I had only a few dollars to my name, and none of them were prepared for their sacrificed college tuition. My father was more of a leader in those following years than I'd ever seen him the years of my youth. Though my family was one on the wealthier side of things, it was unnecessary for him to spot the tuition. He put me up in the best dorms and paid for every cent of my degrees. There I was, off to the shimmering premise of the New York dream, something that enthralled me in all its brevity and splendor. In all the daydreams of my schooling years, the notion of big city life proved tireless in edging out all my other passions. For all that remained of my hopes was making a name for myself in the big city. It was odd to me that he refused to put me up there, instead of opting to buy a small cottage in North Hills. It was an inexpensive little isle connected to the eastern stretch of Manhattan, a very wealthy isle. I was almost certain that the whole of New York City could not match the price of one echo in the expanse of North Hills. Nevertheless, the cottage was paid for. All that was left for me to do after leaving home was to move in, which I did after only a few short days of travel. It was an interesting experience traveling from Georgia. The other parts of Savannah had their own benefits, but it was nothing that I couldn't obtain in sight alone from just the skyline of New York City. I had not the pleasure of experiencing it longer, but c'est la vie, as they say. In all the splendor of the little cottage, I had not the privilege of living a normal life. There was one man, one whose name still rings to the darkness of my thoughts, that bore his life into mine. A life that I would have given anything for. A life that he threw away for someone else. Jules Moreci. Unlike the other vile serpents of my blood, Moreci wasn't venomous. Unlike the other writhing animals whose names coursed venom through the blood, Moreci came out unscathed in the end. Many things, especially for the love I have for him, haunt me like the city that he was home to. He was but a fang of the wolf that lived inside him. For he who thinks not to stop and think is he who breathes his last. Moreci came out more human than most, or so it seemed that passion drove through him. He was a kindly person, though he was mad in a much different way. When it seemed most were immune to the venom of passion, Moreci was not the one of the many. It shouldn't be funny to think that even in the aftermath of comparison, he wasn't one of the many. He never was. He, like many others, found themselves pulsing at the heart, twitching at the eye, and frothing at the mouth for their fleshly desires. It was there that his own flaw jaded him more than any other living person. His own internal opposition was deadlier than any other human being that stood against him. Still now I bear the grim truth that the entirety of the affair could have never happened. Perhaps had my father taken the toll of further monetary expense, it would have spared me from the mental bearing of betrayal and loss. Perhaps, had he never put me up in the hills to begin with, the whole thing itself would never have come to be. Let me backtrack, though. Moreci wasn't bad at the end of it. When all the other pawns in the game had been taken out by the queen, the king had only one last breath, and Moreci brought it all back to me. When I was losing the very sense I had, crippled by normality, he held out a wild world to me, and I took it, not knowing the world would change me. The delusions I had then were much worse than the ones that ended the wild world of Mr. Moreci, for at the beginning I had the thought to take Moreci's hand, which rippled the very waters of Eden. Moreci existed of what seemed like a stillness, an image in time that never changed, and captured the dream so many had. A never-ending illusion of what one could have, and what one could make, but just the mirage of a false life. It seemed then that I had what I wanted. A home away from those who loved me, a life away from those that knew me, a start in some place I'd only been in dreams. But still, even in that vivacious world of superfluous colors, worthless glitter, and countless gold, there were many bodies, but only a few true friends. A chest of gold, but only a few valuable pieces. There, in the midst of the North Hills, the cottage stood in a small acre of foliage. On some days I wonder what would have happened had I not sickened myself with the cruel reality of human nature. Had I not poisoned my dreams with the image of a man behind the curtain, the one who pulled the strings of the big city puppets. I sat in the winter wind, wondering what could have happened if I didn't enter the convoluted passions that were meant to come together. Had I stayed in that cottage and reminisced on Georgia instead of fantasized about New York. Maybe, if I had the will, there might have been a way. A way to work out the kinks of my own life. The physical one in my aging figure. The sexual one in the city of dreams. The mental one in my mind, strained by the complexities of human passion, how it finds so many ways to intertwine. The confluence of enigmas was, in part, the beginning of my sanity's bitter end. It illed me, the very notion of New York. I was sick with that hope that might have sought me, but died at the doorstep of time. For there, in the North Hills, there were people that I knew, whose lives I would meet, whose hands I would shake, whose acquaintance I would make, and whose life I would fake. one of which would be my own. One, the friends who laved their every second of life in lies, and one by the gentle name of Jules Moreci. There are a few people I knew held the stature of Moreci. It seemed he was poised permanently in that one stance, embodying both curiosity and character. Few who ever noticed such a thing were most certainly the mark of such a subtle grace. He fluttered in and out of certain circles, some more spiteful than others about his estate. I wouldn't consider any of the partygoers to really be friends of his, but merely moths drawn to the flame he seemed to shine through New York. This attracted the moths, but also the monarchs that soared in his place, in his palace for what he had, and soared out for what they could find through the easier hearts of New York. There's so much people think of me since I met him. There are things that they think of how I think of him. His very existence was what I had thought previously to cease its heart to sin, the vile flue that simmered in its own fire. He symbolized every hearth of disdain that scorched my insides, the unearthly fume that brought its filthy claws to tear at me when people such as him took the center of appeal. Still, in all its fervent scorn, the better part of me admired every part, every faction of flesh that composed the entirety of Jules Moreci. I learned things that year that haunted my life. I brought into my collection of knowledge things about the future that spurred revulsion into my very core. It brought upon the specter of an ended life which I could never escape. Moreci himself was an eccentric. It was what he brought inadvertently into the world that sickened myself with woe. For years after I knew Moreci, I spurned the notion of friendship and family for horrid reflections of the past that still lived within my embittered mind. I was repulsed by the notion of family. I administered my own form of therapy, locked myself away in the dimness of the Western world, and was content to be forgotten. Remembered only as a legend until not remembered at all. All those years that followed, it remained the only thing I was competent to achieve, and I found solace in the dark delight of being unknown, comforted by the depth of immersion of myself that I could then afford, in the seclusion that it yielded one so tired of human beings. There were things that learned themselves, even in the outspokenness of my own ambivalence. I learned the bitter heart of human nature, and the bitterness of those we entrust. Of all the din and dark that employed the night sky with emptiness, there were few whose fading voices truly made empty the vastness of eternity. Moreci was the only exception to this rule. He was the only outlier to the world in all its wondrous insanity. He was the only ruler in all the servitude of the earth and its modern kind. No. Moreci came out well in the end. It wasn't what transpired from his life, or even the howling embers of his molten world. It was what haunted Moreci, the forlorn madness that enwrapped his mind, enwrapped the heart, his world, and the lives of those he came to know. I'll never say that things might have been better had I not known Moreci. I'm a realist above all, but I still never suppress the actuality that more fiendish truths might have been at work. There was much more to the plague of Moreci than what he spread upon others. There was a sense of right and wrong that never could attune itself to his conscience. There was a force of nature that imbued itself into his heart and was striven to self-impartial torture due to its inability to flourish in the corruption of his soul. In the wake of his rise, there fell an omen over New York. There fell a weight over the shoulders of those who knew him. There fell a man, most horridly from all, from the night sky to the scorching world below him. A star that might have been. A world that might have prospered. A young illusion that might have dissolved to be nothing more than a memory of some long-forgotten veil over the eyes of America. If only then he brought himself into his wealth and partial reasoning, my own reality might have been imparted with its own better veil, one which blinds the path from my future to open wide a vibrant path. Some time before it all went to hell, I had hopes that things would be fine. I see now that my hope I had was immensely misplaced.